Inside a storage drawer in a Florida museum sit bones nobody has dared to open in over 100 years. Science has already rebuilt faces, far older than these. The Calusa, one of early America's most powerful nations, still have none, and that is not an accident. The Smithsonian and the Florida Museum have held their remains for generations and never looked. One man came the closest and watched his own discovery crumble in his hands before he could save it. His name was Frank Cushing. The year was 1996. The place was a swamp called Key Marco, still missing. Start with what the Calusa actually were, because the word tribe undersells them badly. They ruled the southwest coast of Florida for more than 2,000 years, and they did it without planting a single row of corn, no maize, no wheat, no agriculture at all, in a hemisphere where almost every major power was built on a harvest. The Calusa built theirs on water, fish, shellfish, mullet, and manatee, pulled from the estuaries of Charlotte Harbor and Pine Island Sound in numbers so reliable they could feed a population historians still argue about. Somewhere between 4,000 and 20,000 people, depending on which study you trust, all under a single hereditary king. For a society that never grew a single crop, that's a population comparable to some of the era's most established farming chiefdoms elsewhere in the southeast. His capital sat on an island that didn't exist until his people built it. Mound Key, in Estero Bay, is roughly 125 acres of shell, piled and packed, and shaped by hand over centuries, until it rose more than 30 feet above the water. Somewhere near the top stood a house Spanish witnesses said could hold 2,000 people at once, and decades of excavation have since located the physical footprint of that same structure on the island's highest point. Cut through the middle of the island runs the Grand Canal, close to 2,000 feet long, wide enough for canoes to move in and out with the tide. On either side of it, archaeologists found something that shouldn't exist on a hunter-fisher-gatherer site: engineered basins, the largest over 36,000 square feet, the second nearly 29,000, both edged with shell and sediment berms rising close to 3 feet. Fish swam in with the tide and got trapped behind those berms as the water dropped, kept alive in captivity until the moment they were needed. A working larder, engineered centuries before refrigeration, in the middle of what people once assumed was just a pile of empty shells. A study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2020 dated their construction to between 1300 and 1400 AD. That's a fish storage system, built with nothing but shell and labor, functioning a full century before Columbus ever left Spain. The engineering didn't stop at the water's edge. Spanish witnesses described the Calusa king wearing a gold headdress and beaded leg bands, the mark of a ruler who collected tribute from towns up and down the coast: feathers, mats, deerskins, and salvage pulled from Spanish ships that wrecked on his reefs. When Spain later tried to plant a fort of its own on that same island, its builders used tabby, a mortar made from burned shell lime, sand, and water. Archaeologists now consider it the earliest known use of tabby construction anywhere in the New World. Spanish masonry poured onto a foundation the Calusa had already built. Even their gardens hint at how far ahead they were. Waterlogged seeds recovered at pineland, chili peppers, and papaya, buried in wet, oxygen-poor soil for roughly 1,900 years, are the oldest evidence of either plant found anywhere in eastern North America. Not full-scale farming, small dooryard gardens tucked in alongside a fishing economy that didn't need them to survive. It's one more detail that refuses to fit the old idea of the Calusa as simple. This was not a primitive coastal camp. Some archaeologists rank the Calusa among the most complex societies ever documented anywhere in the world without agriculture, a distinction usually reserved for farming empires, not fishing villages. This was infrastructure, and it produced a military power capable of humiliating an empire. Ponce de Leon's first contact with the Calusa came in 1513, when he became the first European recorded landing on Florida's coast. It would take him 8 more years to come back and try to stay. In 1521, he returned with roughly 200 colonists, intending to plant Spain's first settlement on the peninsula. The Calusa attacked. In the fighting, an arrow struck Ponce de Leon in the leg. Some historians believe it was tipped with sap from the manchineel tree, one of the most toxic plants in the Americas. He was evacuated to Cuba. He died there weeks later. The man who claimed Florida for the Spanish crown never got to keep it. For nearly 200 years after that, the Calusa held their coast. A Jesuit mission planted right on Mound Key in 1566 collapsed within 3 years, driven out by the same people it was sent to convert. Spain didn't defeat the Calusa. Disease did. Slave raids did. By the 1760s, when Florida changed hands from Spain to Britain, the survivors were gone, dead, scattered, or gone to Cuba. That's the version people know if they know anything at all. Powerful, defiant, extinct. And somewhere in a museum case, usually, there's a small carved cat to go with the story. The Key Marco cat is the closest thing the Calusa have to a famous face. 6 inches of polished buttonwood, part feline, part human, carved with a precision that still stops visitors in front of the glass at the Marco Island Museum. It's beautiful, it's real. It's also, in a strange way, the problem, because it proves the Calusa were sophisticated enough to leave behind art that rivals anything in the ancient world, and yet you can walk through every major museum exhibit on the civilization and never once see a face that belonged to an actual Calusa person. Not a reconstruction, not a scan, not even a serious attempt. You know their art, you do not know their face. And once you notice that gap, you can't stop noticing it. Here's what makes it stranger. This isn't a case where the remains don't exist. Skeletons have been pulled from Calusa sites for well over a century. Usepa Island, Buck Key, Pineland, Mound Key itself. This isn't a case where the science is impossible either. Forensic teams have reconstructed faces from skulls twice, 5 times, even 10 times older than anything Calusa. So if the bones exist, and the science exists, why does this one specific, well-documented, thoroughly excavated nation have no face at all? That question leads somewhere. And it starts with the man who first pulled Calusa material culture into daylight and lost most of it within days. In the spring of 1996, an archaeologist named Frank Cushing led an expedition funded jointly by the Smithsonian and the University of Pennsylvania to a low, swampy site on Marco Island known as Key Marco. What his team found there stunned them. Buried in an oxygen-starved muck pond, preserved by centuries of wet, airless mud, were more than 1,000 wooden and fiber objects, carved animal masks, painted plaques, ceremonial figureheads shaped like deer, alligators, wolves, sea turtles. Among them, the cat. The dig became known as the Pepperhurst Expedition, and it produced the single largest known collection of Native American wooden art ever recovered in North America. What survived the muck was divided between the Smithsonian and the University of Pennsylvania's own museum. The cat itself now belongs to the Marco Island Historical Museum, on loan, sitting behind reinforced glass a few miles from the swamp it came out of. Wet site preservation is rare, and it is fragile, and Cushing's team learned that the hard way. Wood that survives underwater for centuries can start to disintegrate within hours of hitting open air. Fibers curl, paint flakes. Objects that looked whole in the mud crumbled to fragments before they could be stabilized. Cushing's expedition artist, a man named Wells Sawyer, raced to sketch and paint what he could before it was gone. For a number of those pieces, his watercolors are the only record left. The originals didn't survive to be studied. They survived to be painted, and then they were lost. Think about what that means. The single richest excavation of Calusa material culture in history became, in part, an act of accidental destruction. The evidence didn't vanish over centuries. It vanished in days, in the hands of the people who found it. Cushing had built his reputation studying living Pueblo communities in the Southwest. Key Marco should have been the discovery that cemented his career for good, the wettest, richest, most perfectly preserved site any American archaeologist had ever opened. Instead, watching pieces disintegrate in front of him became one of the defining frustrations of his professional life. He died only 3 years later, in 1900, reportedly choking on a fishbone at his own dinner table, an ending nobody could have scripted for a man whose life's work had just been lost to open air. That's the first crack. Here's the second, and it's quieter, but it runs deeper. While Cushing's team was pulling wooden masks out of the mud at Key Marco, other excavators, working other Calusa sites over the following decades, were pulling something else out of the ground: bones. Human remains, collected from Usepa Island, Buck Key, and later Pineland, ended up scattered across institutional collections: the Smithsonian, the Florida Museum of Natural History, university archives. And there they mostly stayed, not destroyed, not lost, just shelved. A researcher named Dale Hutchinson, working out of the University of North Carolina, did go back to that material. He published detailed studies on Buck Key remains in 1992, on Usepa Island remains in 1999, and on Pineland material again in 2013. Real science, real analysis, bone density, stature estimates, dental wear, signs of stress and disease, even healed fractures that point to a hard, physically demanding life spent working the water. But here's the catch. Those findings live almost entirely inside university monographs, printed in small runs, sitting on research library shelves, never digitized, never built into a public account of who these people actually were. You could walk into the Florida Museum's own exhibits and never encounter most of what Hutchinson found. The data exists. The public version of the Calusa doesn't include it. Compare that to Pineland alone, where systematic excavation beginning in the 1980s eventually produced more than 140,000 catalog specimens, one of the largest single-site collections in the state. The capacity to document the Calusa in exhaustive detail clearly exists. It's just never been pointed at their skeletons in any way the public actually sees. A research center opened at Pineland in 1996 on land donated by a private family, and it built a public trail now walked by thousands of visitors a year. In 2015, a land trust donated an additional burial mound in Midden to expand that trail even further. Almost nothing along it explains what the people buried nearby actually looked like. And there's a third layer to the silence, one that shows up in the paperwork rather than in the dirt. Under a federal law called enigma, museums that receive federal funding are required to inventory Native American remains and, where possible, work toward returning them to descendant communities. The Florida Museum has an active NAGPRA program, and their own public reporting shows the scale of what's still sitting in storage. In 2023 alone, their repatriation filings accounted for 26 ancestors, along with thousands of associated funerary objects. 26 in a single year. And their own NAGPRA coordinator, speaking to a reporter in 2024, said plainly that the work completed so far is, in her words, a drop in the bucket compared to what remains. Read that sentence again. A drop in the bucket. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's an institution's own coordinator describing the size of what's left undone. A nationwide database built by investigative journalists has tracked this exact pattern across the country. Human remains held for decades under a bureaucratic label, culturally unidentifiable, a classification that can keep bones in storage indefinitely with no clear path forward. It isn't always slow, though. In 2008, the Florida Museum completed its largest single repatriation ever, returning 366 ancestors recovered from a site in Citrus County in one coordinated action. So when it matters enough to someone, institutions can move fast. The Calusa, so far, simply haven't been that priority. So now you have 3 separate silences, stacking on top of each other, objects destroyed within days of discovery in 1896, skeletal data buried in monographs nobody outside academia reads, and a repatriation backlog so large that a museum professional calls her own institution's decades of progress a drop in the bucket. None of that is evidence of a cover-up in the cinematic sense. Nobody hid a file, Nobody erased a record. It's something more mundane and honestly more believable. A century of underfunded, deprioritized, quietly stalled attention to one specific nation's remains. But mundane doesn't mean harmless. It means the Calusa fell through a gap nobody was watching. Which brings us to the one place where a Calusa description does survive, and it comes from the last person you'd trust to describe them fairly. His name was Hernando de Escalante Fontaneda. Around 1549, as a teenager, he was shipwrecked off the Florida coast and taken captive by the Calusa. He stayed among them for roughly 17 years, not as a guest, but as a prisoner who learned the language, watched the court of the Calusa king, and survived long enough to be ransomed out. Decades later, he wrote a memoir. It's the single richest first-hand account of Calusa life that exists. Geography, town names, customs, the structure of the king's court, even, chillingly, descriptions of ritual sacrifice. Historians still use it as a foundational source. But notice what it doesn't do. Fontaneda barely describes what the Calusa looked like. Height, build, facial features, almost nothing. What survives instead is filtered through the eyes of a frightened captive teenager who spent nearly 2 decades inside a culture he never chose to join, and who wrote it all down for a Spanish audience after the fact. It's the closest thing to a portrait the Calusa have, and it was painted, in words, by the empire that would eventually help destroy them. Even the name is disputed. Fontaneda translated Calusa as meaning fierce people. Other historians think it may echo the name of the Spanish emperor of the time, Charles V, Carlos, adopted or imposed as the ruler's title during decades of contact. 2 different explanations for the same word, and after 500 years, nobody has settled which one is true. There's a secondary claim that circulates in popular accounts that the Calusa stood roughly 4 inches taller than the Spanish colonists who met them. It's a striking detail, and it may reflect real observations passed down through Spanish accounts of tall, physically imposing Floridians. But it traces back to a secondary, genealogical compilation, not a peer-reviewed skeletal study. Interesting, plausible, not proven. That's the difference between a fact and a theory worth flagging, and this niche lives or dies on knowing which is which. So here's where the investigation actually turns. If skeletal remains exist, if Fontaneda gives us fragments, if the science to build a real face already exists and has been used successfully elsewhere, what happens when you actually apply modern forensic method to what we know? None of this means bone analysis alone is useless. Separate isotope studies of Calusa bone collagen have already shown a population living almost entirely off the estuary, fish and shellfish, over anything grown in soil, with measurable signs of nutritional stress that only start appearing after European contact begins. There's no evidence either that the Calusa practiced artificial cranial shaping, the kind of intentional head binding seen in some other pre-Columbian societies, which means whatever a reconstructed Calusa skull looked like, it would reflect a face shaped entirely by biology, not custom. The bones have already told researchers what the Calusa ate, how healthy they were, and roughly when that health started to break down. What the bones can't tell you, on their own, is what a Calusa face actually looked like, walking through the reeds 400 years ago. That question needs a scan, and the scan has never happened. Forensic facial reconstruction isn't magic, and it isn't guesswork either. It starts with a skull, either the original bone or more often now, a 3D printed copy made from a CT scan. Around that skull, researchers place tissue depth markers at dozens of specific points on the face, using statistical averages built from thousands of real CT scans of living people. Cheekbone width tells you eye spacing. Nasal aperture shape tells you nose width. Jaw structure tells you the lower face. Layer by layer, in clay or in software, a face gets built on top of the bone. It's part measurement, part interpretation, The bone gives you structure. It does not give you skin tone, hair color, or eye color. For that, you need something else entirely. You need DNA. The method itself isn't new. Facial approximation traces back more than a century to German anatomists in the 1880s who first measured soft tissue depth on cadavers and built mathematical tables from the results. Modern forensic teams refine those tables using thousands of CT scans of living patients, turning rough anatomical guesswork into something closer to statistical prediction. Police departments use it today on unidentified remains found decades after death, faces rebuilt well enough that living relatives have recognized them. It's precise enough now to help identify murder victims, precise enough to rebuild pharaohs. Even Tutankhamun's face, sealed for over 3,000 years inside solid gold, has been reconstructed more than once from CT data pulled directly off his mummy. It has simply never been asked a single question about the Calusa. And that's exactly where two of the most famous reconstructions in the world went wrong, and then went right. In the mid-1990s, a 9,000-year-old skeleton was found along the banks of the Columbia River in Washington state. The first anthropologist to examine it, James Chatters, described the skull's features using the outdated term Caucasoid. A facial reconstruction followed, sculpted to match that call, and it looked, almost eerily, like the actor Patrick Stewart. The bust sat on public display for years, a confident, detailed, entirely mistaken face representing an entire vanished population. For years, that image fueled theories that the first Americans weren't ancestors of modern native populations at all. It became a legal battle, dragging through federal court for nearly a decade, scientists on one side, tribal nations on the other, arguing over who even had the right to study the bones. Then, in 2015, a team led by geneticist Eske Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen sequenced the man's actual DNA. The result? He was most closely related to living Native American populations. Not European, not Polynesian, Native American, full stop. The bone-based guess had been wrong. The genetics corrected it. In 2017, Kennewick Man, properly called the Ancient One, was repatriated and reburied. That should have ended the debate. It didn't, not for years. But it did prove something the field needed proving. A face built from bone alone can be confidently, publicly, embarrassingly wrong. And DNA is the only thing that can catch the mistake. Cheddar Man tells the same story from the other direction. Roughly 10,000 years old, found in a cave in England, he was originally reconstructed with pale skin, the assumption most people would have made without hesitation. Then in 2018, researchers at University College London and the Natural History Museum sequenced his DNA. The result upended the assumption. His pigmentation profile placed him among the most heavily pigmented categories researchers use: dark, possibly dark to black skin, paired, strangely, with blue eyes. One of the scientists on the project put it simply: the racial categories people use to imagine the deep past are, in his words, very modern constructions. The bones hadn't changed. The face built purely from bone had been wrong in a way nobody expected, and only the DNA caught it. Two separate cases, two separate continents. The same lesson twice. Skull shape can tell you a great deal. It cannot tell you everything. And the piece it can't tell you. The piece that actually decides what a reconstructed face looks like to a modern audience only comes from genetic material. Which brings the investigation back to Florida, and to a site far older and far stranger than anything Calusa. At a place called Wendover, near Titusville, construction crews in the 1980s uncovered a peat bog containing the remains of more than 160 individuals, some 7,000 to 8,000 years old. Peat does something most burial environments can't. Its acidic, oxygen-starved chemistry slows bacterial decay to a crawl, the same conditions that mummify bog bodies in northern Europe. At Wendover, that chemistry held on to something nobody expected to survive at all: brain tissue, preserved inside roughly 90 skulls. Researchers extracted and analyzed genetic material from that tissue, among the oldest human DNA ever successfully recovered at the time, published in the journal Nature in 1986. Wendover sits less than a day's drive from Calusa territory. It proves that ancient Florida, under the right conditions, can hold on to DNA for thousands of years longer than anyone would expect. Sit with that for a second. 7,000-year-old brain tissue survived in a Florida bog. Calusa remains, by comparison, are only a few centuries old, practically modern on that timescale. If DNA can survive that long in Florida's peat, the odds of recoverable genetic material in far younger Calusa bone are on paper better, not worse. Nobody has checked. That's not a theory. That's not speculation dressed up as fact. It's a documented, stated gap. The Florida Museum's own research center says outright that no genetic information exists for the Calusa, and that this makes it impossible to link them into the broader genetic map of human movement across the continent. Wendover proves the science is possible in this exact region. Kennewick Man and Cheddar Man prove why it matters, because bone-based guesses about ancestry and appearance have been wrong before, publicly and dramatically wrong. And still, across every Calusa site, across every collection sitting in storage, across 130 years since Cushing's crew pulled a wooden cat out of the mud, the test has never been run. So the major reversal isn't some hidden fake or a forged artifact or a secret chamber. It's simpler than that, and somehow more unsettling. This was never a story about whether a Calusa face could be reconstructed. It's a story about the fact that nobody ever tried. Not because it's impossible, because the science that could do it has simply never been pointed in this direction. The silence isn't a cover-up. It's an absence, and absences in archaeology are their own kind of evidence. There's a second reversal folded inside the first, and it's the uncomfortable one. If you strip away the paintings, the museum dioramas, the artistic reconstructions built by illustrators working from educated guesses, what's actually left of the Calusa's appearance in the historical record is Fontanetta's memoir, written by a captive, filtered through fear, distance, and decades of memory, framed for a Spanish audience that had every reason to see the Calusa as something to be conquered. Their most complete surviving portrait comes from inside the very empire that spent 2 centuries trying to destroy them. That's not a conspiracy, it's just the truth about how this particular history got recorded, and it's worth sitting with before moving on. There's a third layer, and it's the quietest of all. The 1896 dig at Key Marco should have been the moment the Calusa's material world got preserved for good. Instead, it became the moment most of it was lost. Not to time, not to looters, but to the simple fact that nobody in 1896 had the conservation science to keep wet wood intact once it hit open air. The Calusa's face was erased twice, once by history, slowly, over 2 centuries of disease and displacement, and once by accident, in a matter of days, in the hands of the very people trying to save it. None of that ends the story, though, because unlike a lot of ancient mysteries, this one is still actively, currently unfinished, and the unfinished part is where the real conflict lives now. Start with the paperwork. NAGPRA doesn't just require museums to catalog remains. It requires consultation with descendant communities before anything, including scientific testing, can move forward. Consultation isn't a formality on paper either. It typically means tribal representatives reviewing proposed research, and sometimes rejecting it outright before a single test ever gets approved. And that raises a question this story can't skip past. Who actually gets to speak for the Calusa today? The official histories often describe the Calusa as extinct, wiped out by the 1760s, gone without a trace. The Seminole tribe of Florida's own Tribal Historic Preservation Office disputes that framing directly. Their published position states that some Calusa were absorbed into the Bear Clan of the Seminole people, and that their descendants, in their words, thrive today as part of the Seminole tribe. Other Calusa survivors are believed to have fled to Cuba and merged into coastal communities there, though that thread has never been traced with anywhere near the same care as the Seminole connection. So the word extinct, repeated in documentary after documentary, in museum label after museum label, isn't a settled fact. It's a disputed one, and it's disputed by the very community with the strongest claim to an opinion on it. That matters enormously for the Reconstruction question because it means any future attempt to test or scan Calusa remains isn't just a scientific decision. It's a decision that would require the consent, involvement, and authority of living descendant communities the popular version of this story keeps writing out of the ending. And the story isn't standing still while that question goes unanswered. Fieldwork at Mound Key and Pineland has continued into the 2020s. Researchers using LiDAR and ground-penetrating radar have mapped buried structures beneath the surface, including a rectangular footprint roughly 75 feet long on a rise researchers call Surf Clam Ridge that nobody had identified before satellite-era survey tools existed. Archaeologists have gone back to the 1614 Spanish attack on Calusa territory, walking the ground with metal detectors to trace the battle, matching buried Spanish material against the written record of what happened that year. In late 2024, construction began on a new public archaeology facility at the Mound House site on Fort Myers Beach, the first dedicated public archaeology lab on that stretch of coast, opening the following year, complete with a conservation room where visitors can watch specimens get stabilized in real time, the very step that didn't exist in 1896. In 2026, a public television series called Decoding Ancient Florida began covering the Calusa directly, bringing Mound Key, Pineland, and Mound House to audiences who had likely never heard the name before. One exhibit at the Florida Museum even stages the moment a Calusa king, Carlos himself, receives a rival Tequesta leader inside his court in the year 1564, a fully imagined scene built carefully from Spanish records, standing in for a face science still hasn't confirmed. If that consultation ever happens, and a Calusa face is finally built from bone and ideally from real genetic data, it would be the first time in over 4 centuries that anyone has looked at an actual likeness of a Calusa person, rather than an artist's best guess. Every painting on a museum wall right now, however carefully researched, is still an interpretation. A reconstruction would be the first thing built from the person, rather than the myth. The ground is still being surveyed, the archives are still being processed, the story is not closed, it's paused, mid-sentence, waiting on a test nobody has scheduled, and a consultation nobody has finished. So picture it one more time. Somewhere in a storage collection, Florida Museum, Smithsonian, it hardly matters which, there's a drawer holding Calusa remains that have sat unscanned since before your grandparents were born. Not hidden, not secret, just waiting. The way institutional collections wait, behind acid-free paper and a catalog number nobody has prioritized in over a century. Somewhere else, in an archive far from Florida, there's a folder of Wells Sawyer's watercolors, the only surviving image of wooden masks that turned to dust within days of leaving the mud that had protected them for centuries. A painting of a face that no longer physically exists, made by the hand of the man who accidentally let the real thing crumble. That's what's actually behind the glass in this story. Not a monster, not a hoax, not a hidden treasure. A gap. 130 years wide, and getting narrower every time a researcher picks up a LiDAR scanner or opens a drawer that hasn't been touched in a generation. The Calusa built a capital out of shell that still stands under 30 feet of engineered mound. They stopped an empire's colonization attempt in its tracks and killed the man who claimed their land for a king who never set foot on it. And after all of that, after the canals, the water courts, the golden headdress, the 2 centuries of resistance, the one thing modern science still hasn't given them is the most basic thing a human being has: a face. The bones are still in the drawer. The watercolor is still in the folder. The question is still open. And somewhere between a museum and Gainesville, a repatriation office, still working through a backlog, it calls a drop in the bucket, and a tribal historic preservation office insisting the story isn't over, somebody, eventually, is going to have to decide whether to finally look